Again, my name is Veronica Parker with AEBG Tab, and today's webinar topic is Student MIS Data Elements with Mark Bean of RP Group and Randy Tillery of WestEd. The PowerPoint presentation for today's webinar is available to download in the resource pod under Resources, PowerPoint, and Handouts. If you select the file titled AEBG Student Characteristics Webinar and today's date and select Download File, you will be able to download the file within your web browser and be able to follow along with today's webinar presentation. So please be sure to do that. And if you have any questions, please be sure to post those questions into the chat pod. For today's webinar presentation, most questions will either be addressed towards the end of the webinar, and if not, they will be addressed via a offline within a mini kind of FAQs that will be posted to the adult education website. So if your questions are not answered immediately or maybe not addressed at all, you will find out at the end of the webinar what's going to happen. And so just please be on the lookout for further information. We haven't forgotten about you or we're not ignoring you. Just we want to make sure we get through all of the content and provide you with expert answers on your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the California Adult Education website later on this afternoon. And I'll be sure to post the URL of exactly where this webinar recording and the PowerPoint will be housed. So if you have to leave for any time or if you'd like to come back to the webinar to view anything, you will be able to do so by using the California Adult Education website. Again, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please be sure to let us know in the chat pod. Melinda and I are on hand to assist you in any way we can. And now I will turn it over to Randy, who will get us started with today's webinar. Randy?
Thank you, Veronica. Welcome, everybody, today. Mark and I are very excited to do part 2 of our little webinar series on the new data elements and reporting for the adult education program, the program formerly known as AEBG. So we're going to, I want to say that before I dive in, that we recognize that, we did a webinar last week on student momentum and progress. We're doing one on the new MIS data elements for adult education, for student characteristics. However, this is really an ongoing dialogue with the field. The RP listserv has been hot and heavy with people asking questions of each other about how they're collecting some of this data that they don't get through CCC Apply. And that there's a lot of work that we're going to be doing throughout the fall to kind of help bring clarity to how people should be thinking about collecting this information. And we'll address that actually in the webinar as well. So we're going to talk about primarily 3 things today. We're going to talk about the new student characteristic MIS elements. We're going to talk about the special populations with barriers to employment elements. We're going to talk about the student element for work-based learning and the student element for pre-apprenticeship. As we're going to frame that within the broader landscape of the alignment between adult education and the Workforce and Innovation Opportunity Act, Wioa, and we'll talk a little bit about challenges related to data collection. So we're going to provide as good an overview as we can today. We're not going to provide you necessarily with hard and firm answers about everything, but we're going to kind of keep the dialogue moving forward so we can get additional clarity and help you as best we can. So the audience today, I just want to note that like 256 people registered for this webinar. So it is a very diverse audience. I know that we have researchers because I've seen some names floating by. I know that we have practitioners. I'd imagine we have administrators on as well. So, I'm going to start with a kind of a high-level overview of around adult education, just to be sure. And some of this will be a little bit of repeat from last week, and I apologize for that. But I just want to be sure that we're all kind of starting at approximately the same place as we move. So, just a little bit of background on data and accountability in the adult education block grant program. I first started working on this program about a year and a half ago. Kathy Booth and I ran a series of field teams with practitioners to produce a report to the legislature that identified all of the metrics and programs and the ways we were going to measure effectiveness of consortia and report to the legislature. So we produced a report in August of 2017 called Measuring Our Success. It provides clear definitions of the students' programs and the core measures for adult education for both K-12 adult education and community college non-credit. for the purposes of the adult education program in California, adult education is defined by students in the adult education programs in either a K-12 adult school or a community college non-credit program. So that is the primary population we're talking about. And when we're talking about the data elements today, that will be the population we're primarily focused on in terms of how you use these elements. It was an extensive process. It was sort of a sprint over 8 weeks. We had over 40 hours of meetings with 3 different teams, 35 practitioners. We also talked about the processes for data collection and alignment of measures for student assessment progress and success. And that we do address, the alignment of adult education with key Wioa metrics and definitions from places like Perkins and Title IV, et cetera. So it's a pretty quick read as a document, and if you want more background on the data and accountability system overall, I strongly recommend that you go pull it down from the AEG website and take a look at it. So since then, what we have done is we have now created a launch board adult education pipeline data tab. That went live on Friday, and my understanding is that the ERP immediately got besieged with requests for logins, and so I'm trying to get everyone their login information so they can actually look at their data. And there's other ways in which I think this report has actually influenced the chancellor's office in the field. So a lot of the adult education metrics in this report have now been adopted for the new simplified metrics that will be rolling out in the fall as well. So in the student types, one of the student types that is being tracked in the simplified metrics are adult education and ESL students, specifically to be sure that we're capturing what's going on in the non-credit universe. You're sitting behind the adult education tab we have a data element dictionary that is available on the TAP website, caladulted.org. I think sent out links to that last week, so if you want to pull that down and take a look at it. It is under revision for the second build. The second build of the tab, our plans right now are to have that live in January. This is just showing the tab. So it's basically, we have organized the tab in a way that really aligns to student progress and momentum frameworks. There's kind of a scorecard that captures key metrics that we're reporting to the state legislature every year. So you can see how your consortium or your agency is doing on key metrics. And then we look at student enrollment and programs. We look at student progress. We look at student transition to post-secondary or transition to adult secondary education, which is a key metric for adult education. We look at various forms of completion, and we do look at employment. Once again, this webinar today is not about the launch board per se. We will probably be doing a webinar demoing the pipeline sometime soon. We haven't quite scheduled that yet. So it's important to note that the metrics that are defined both in the report and that are displayed in the launch board rely heavily on student characteristics data elements. So this includes a program area that's defined in AB 104 called Workforce Entry and Reentry that actually looks at student success in workforce preparation or CTE programs using the special populations criteria to say, this is a type of student who is like formerly incarcerated, who is highly likely to be entering or re-entering the workforce. And so it's just a way of looking at CTE or workforce preparation programs through the lens of specific populations. Pre-apprenticeship training programs rely on the pre-apprenticeship flag. Programs for adults with disabilities and adults with disabilities participating in ESL, ABE, ASE, or CTE programs, which are 2 ways that we look at the AWD population, rely on the special POPs flags for those individuals. Attainment of an occupational skills gain, which we talked about last week, relies on the work-based learning flag. And just eventually in the second build, you will be able to disaggregate any of the outcome metrics by special populations. So if you want to look at the educational functioning level attainment for basically someone in a reentry program, if you want to look at for someone who's within 2 years of exhausting their TANF eligibility, for someone who's homeless, you will be able to look at any of the outcomes vis-a-vis the special population. So one of the reasons that this is so important to us and that we begin collecting this information, particularly the barriers to employment characteristics, is that so much of the data we're collecting really relies on that in order to display correctly. So why are we doing this? I always throw this slide in here because I kind of just like it, but it's important to talk about a little bit about the framing of why it's important that we capture this information, and really why are we focusing so heavily on that and on Wioa definitions for adult ed in California. First of all, adult education in California serves pretty much the most vulnerable populations with the most significant barriers to employment or educational success, meaning that a lot of the special populations are disproportionately and highly represented in the adult education population. So, and it's a diverse group with diverse barriers. So being able to differentiate, how you're serving different types of students is pretty significant to the field. A little bit of background on adult education. It's a large program in California. So it's 700,000 students in 2016-17 were served by K-12 adult schools and community college non-credit programs. That number is going to climb to well over 800,000 this year, I believe, if not a little bit higher. And, the student space, just to kind of capturing the barrier. So this is from 2016-17. 54% of students in adult education do not have a high school diploma, so they have no educational attainment. Their employment status, at 42% of them report as being unemployed and 70% not in the labor force. And about 68% of them speak their a native language other than English. So these are folks who are really facing challenges in terms of getting employment, in terms of really engaging with the educational system. And so what it means is we're probably serving disproportionately large numbers of adults with significant barriers to employment. And it's just important to be able to kind of think about how we can disaggregate outcomes, because you can look at global outcomes, but then the question is, how do your outcomes look like for different people you're serving? So that really pertains to the progress metrics, EFL attainment, workforce preparation, occupational skills, transition from ABE or ESL to adult secondary education, or transition to post-secondary education, completion of a diploma or high school equivalency, or completion of a post-secondary credential. And then employment. It's really, the field has been very, very clear, practitioners both in non-credit programs and in K-12 adult schools, that they want to see how they're doing for different discrete populations. And Wioa provides a very convenient framework. I just threw this slide in here because this is showing that we are really using the student momentum points as the right way to think about kind of how we do the 3-year planning process for adult education this year. So you can see student progress, transition, completion, and outcomes after exit, and we've aligned activities or strategies for practitioners to use in the field. So we're trying to really be consistent about the way we're thinking about both how we're evaluating the effectiveness of folks and how we're putting tools in their hands to actually help them plan for the future and to become more effective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about adult education and Wioa. Why is Wioa so significant to adult education? Well, at the federal level, adult education is governed under Title II of Wioa, and the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. So the federal government provides funding across the country for adult education programs, specifically for adult basic education, adult secondary education, and ESL programs. In California, that's over $80 million that are distributed both to colleges and adult schools. Nearly all K-12 adult schools and 20 or so, I believe, community colleges receive Wioa Title II funding and are required to report educational skills gains and outcomes through the national reporting system for Wioa compliance that includes the special populations reporting, which is why we focus so much on the alignment with Wioa, to be sure that people are able to sort of capture data one time to report to all the various places they need to. In AB 104, which was the legislation that created the Adult Education Block Grant Program, now the AEP program, alignment with Wioa is required for adult education. So it says it very explicitly that adult education should be aligning with other major frameworks, including the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. In California, the state agencies, like the Labor Agency and CDE and the Chancellor's Office, are developing standards and guidance for co-enrollment into adult ed, all of the Wioa titles, Title 1, 2, 3, and 4, and other state programs. So the best framework for that alignment for co-enrolling folks and being able to capture data in the same way is a focus on Wioa. And it's important to note that Perkins reauthorization includes expanded definitions for special populations that are about 95% aligned with the special populations and barriers to employment under Wioa. So it's just a way of me hammering you over the head about the fact that really Wioa is sort of, we have aligned to Wioa in every way we possibly can in the development of the metrics and in many of our core definitions. Um, so in the California Adult Education Program, we adopted multiple definitions straight from Wioa. That includes completion of post-secondary credentials. That includes the definitions for measurable skills gains related to educational functioning level attainment and occupational skills gains. So I would recommend, if you don't know what I'm talking about in terms of EFL attainment, that you actually take a look at the PowerPoint that we did last week for the student progress presentation, because we go into that in great detail there. So that is a very useful tool for catching up on things if you weren't on last week's webinar. Workforce preparation, both the definition of what workforce preparation is and the metric for a workforce preparation milestone that the field asked us to create. We adopted the pre-apprenticeship quality standards, and we adopted the 13 populations with barriers to employment as defined in Wioa. And the other part of sort of the really strategic importance of alignment is you have K-12 adult schools and you have community colleges. They have different reporting systems. So adult education reports through TOPS Pro Enterprise. Now colleges for adult ed have been reporting through TOPS Pro Enterprise through 17-18, but this year we're pulling the data from MIS. So we'll be capturing all the community college data through regular MIS reporting. The only exception will be the 20 or so community college non-credit programs who are funded through Wioa Title II. So we will be capturing some of their data from MIS, and we'll be capturing some things through TOPS Pro Enterprise, because they will still be reporting for Wioa Title II compliance. So we'll be capturing things like EFL attainment through TOPS Pro. So we really focused on alignment as an enormous issue wherever we could, to really be sure that we're collecting the same data in basically the same way, which is the reason we created the new elements moving forward. These are the 13 Wioa populations with barriers to employment. All of the new special populations elements are meant to fill gaps where we don't collect these currently. There are some that we did collect, but we created a number of new elements this year that you'll begin collecting data on for us to be able to disaggregate by these populations in the launch board and for reporting purposes. Data collection for barriers to employment. I just want to talk about this a little bit because this has been sort of the hot topic on the RP listserv. And just to clarify some misconceptions and kind of what we know currently. A lot of people have asked if we will be collecting the barriers to employment characteristics through CCC Apply. And this is not a chancellor's office response formally, but I've been in that work group in those conversations, and that is not going to happen. I'm about 99% sure of that. If anything, the direction of CCC Apply will be moving towards simplifying it, so that students are having to provide a little bit less sensitive information about themselves in order to be able to sort of enroll at the college, and that colleges may be expected to do more supplemental data collection around key data about their students moving forward. That is a process that's moving forward. There's conversations going on about what that might look like. I know for non-credit programs in particular, because I'm working with all the large non-credit providers around the state, they would like a non-credit CCC Apply application that is dirt simple, kind of name, rank, and serial number, and then they bring the students in and do extensive onboarding with them and collect any supplemental information they need to once they get students in the door. Part of the reasoning for that is that the intention of non-credit is to have as few barriers between the student and the educational process as possible. One of the great values of adult education in California has been access, so that if I walk down the street to my son or daughter's elementary school, I may be able to take an ESL class, just walk in the door and sit in on a class, and they're kind of enrolling me and collecting information, really right then. So it's really to kind of have it be as accessible as possible. And the fact of the matter is 40% of colleges in California do not use, of non-credit programs in the state don't use CCC Apply, because non-credit students just don't complete it. They don't make it through the process because of all the residency questions and the other kind of sensitive information it's trying to collect from them. What all this means, that's a very long way of saying that K-12 adult schools and college non-credit programs should plan to use some kind of supplemental data collection process to collect information about their students for special populations. Whether you could do that as part of student onboarding after your application when you get them in the door, or you could incorporate it into other data collection processes such as BATIA survey processes. I've seen that kind of floating around on the RP listserv as well. This is very sensitive information. Students may be very hesitant to share some of these things prior to actually maybe arriving at your school. And oftentimes they need to build up a certain amount of trust with how the information might be used before they actually provide this to you. Generally, the barriers to employment are self-reported by the student. There's no expectation that if someone says that they're within 2 years of exhausting TANF, that you're going to verify that with your county CalWORKS program. So you may have some verification processes related to foster youth or other populations, although sometimes, very often, students in non-credit programs are not part of the kind of formal kind of processes for serving kind of foster youth and college campuses in all cases. I'm also wanted to note here that the RP group, and Mark specifically, is convening a group of folks to explore the development of common protocols for gathering barriers to employment data, including ways of framing the questions related to that. And Mark, I'm going to let you talk about that a little bit so you can kind of update people about where you are in that process.
All right, thank you. So that was a great introduction, and I want to say thank you to everyone for your comments in the chat room. I want to give everyone a second to make sure that the sound is working well. And as Randy has set us up so clearly, I'm ready to talk about the specific changes we've made to the MIS.
Mark, I'm going to interrupt. This is Melinda Holt on the tech support here. We can barely hear you. So if you could move the microphone closer to you, it's like you're sitting like 20 feet from it.
Gosh, I must have a really small microphone.
Okay, there's a microphone icon at the very top of your screen. If you click the little white arrow next to it, it will allow you to adjust your volume a little bit. And while I'm on the line, everybody else, if you're having a hard time hearing Mark, then you have a little audio icon with a little white arrow next to it. Click the little white arrow and you should be able to pump your volume up just a little bit. So that should help everybody. If the participants pump up their volume and if Mark pumps up his microphone.
All right, testing. I want to say thank you to everyone, especially to Melinda for helping us with the sound. I'm ready to talk about the changes that were made to our MIS data reporting, specifically changes to the student basic and special populations fields. You can see we made quite a few changes this year, and they all went into effect as of summer 2018. And so I would like to be able to get through some of this so we can talk about how we can implement changes at the state. So first of all, the Student CalWORKS added a new data element, SC18, and this is related to the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF. Randy mentioned earlier, we need to know if a student is within 2 years of exhausting their TANF eligibility. And I see right now that this does not mention TANF anywhere in the data element, even though it's a CalWORKS field. And I think that's probably one of the things that we want to ask the Chancellor's Office to address, is perhaps help clarify that language, make that connection clear for everyone. So the next slide talks about special population SG14, student economically disadvantaged status. And I can see here that we've tried to match the Wioa categories by creating 8 different possible types of economically disadvantaged status. I'm going to go to the next slide so you can see how those groups are similar to the groups identified in the actual language. These categories in the MIS are reported in 2 positions, and the first position identifies which one of these 8 different types of economic disadvantage best describes that student. And if you'll read in the directions at the bottom of that page, it asks you to report them in a hierarchy. So if a student meets multiple types of disadvantaged status, you would choose the lowest number and report that. Then the second position identifies whether you receive this information from the student self-report or an auditable source. This is very similar to the way that we have collected and reported data for Perkins and Vatia in the past. So I want to mention, because most of the data elements used to determine economically disadvantaged status are also recommended that SG14 be used for reporting that status for non-credit students. And I think this might cause confusion in the field, because it's unclear where we report economically disadvantaged status if it's in more than one place, and whether or not we have referential or syntactical edits to check to see if the student is reported as disadvantaged in both data elements. And so before everyone asks these questions, I have formed a group to get some input from the field and make some suggestions to the Chancellor's office so that we can have some clarity regarding this data element, because it does overlap with some others. The next one is ex-offender status, SG15. This is a new data element. We used to track this data element in a different place. In the student basic file, there was an old data element once used for this type of student characteristic. Well, now it is considered a special population that we have to track, and so the question has been redesigned, and it is explained here with the actual Wioa language. It is the perception of some of us in the field that we would like some clarity about how best to collect this question so that we can accurately report it and identify these students, and also at the same time not create another barrier for them to enrollment. And I think our work group would like to work on that as well. SG16 is another tricky one. There's a new data element to track homeless status for students. And then we have to figure out a way to ask students if they were homeless, and how would you ask that question in a way that was consistent across the state. So we're going to seek input on that. This is the actual Wioa definition of homeless, and you can see it's really quite complicated, and at the same time there are some boundaries that we might consider. So I have asked for input from the field, and our work group is going to look at that and collectively provide some suggestions or some best practices so that everyone can perhaps implement a consistent way for data collection on homeless students. And I've also noticed homeless was part of the economically disadvantaged status earlier. So right there, H is a homeless individual. So again, we want to make sure that we're consistently collecting one data element and reporting it wherever it needs to be reported. Another new data element is special population SG17, long-term unemployment status. And it defines what unemployment for long-term is, has been unemployed for 27 or more consecutive weeks. We want to make sure that we're also helping students understand the difference between being unemployed or perhaps someone who is not seeking work. And so we would want some clarification on that as well. SG18 is a student's cultural barrier status. And this is self-reported or self-identified, and the language says as possessing attitudes, beliefs, customs, or practices that influence a way of thinking, acting, or working that may serve as a hindrance to employment. And so we think that there might be some room for some explanation or examples of what a student might identify as a cultural barrier, and we could work on that as our work group also. There is no additional formal criteria for making that determination that the student has a cultural barrier to employment. So I think this is probably going to need some input from the field to help us work with students. SG19 is a seasonal farm worker status, and some of you probably remember we also have migrant farm workers collected under the VATIA data file. They are subtly different definitions, and I think that we would like some input from the field to be clear on how to collect these data. SG20 is a student's literacy status, and we have already discussed in our previous webinar about educational functional levels and identifying students with a low level of literacy. This overlaps with some of that work, and we might find ways to use either assessments or educational functional levels to help inform students' characteristics so that this may be auto-populated based on some of the other evidence and assessments that we use. Now is pre-apprenticeship and work-based learning status. I'm going to pause for a moment to see if we have some questions, and then I'm going to let Randy talk about these two categories.
So a couple questions, Mark, that have come up that I've been sort of answering in the chat. There was a question about why we have the additional way of reporting economically disadvantaged students, and that's because many of the regular elements such as Pell eligibility or eligibility for a California Promise Grant do not apply to non-credit students, and so the creation of that element was specifically so we can capture that information about non-credit students. So that created, then there was a follow-up question about does that mean that the colleges do not have to report the special populations elements for credit students? And my response to that is that the Chancellor's Office has issued no specific clarification or guidance on whether they expect colleges to report the 13 barriers to employment for credit students. And because this webinar is focused primarily on adult education, we're really focusing on being sure this reporting is happening for non-credit students, because that is who we pick up for the Launch Board tab. There was a question here about cultural barriers. That there needs to be more exploration. I mean, as I've heard the cultural barriers kind of discussed in the Wioa world, it creates confusion in that world as well. But the way I've had it explained to me is if the person perceives they have a cultural barrier that's keeping them from employment, then they have a cultural barrier to employment. It's really squishy. So Mark, I think this is one of the things your group is going to want to think about in terms of how you provide clarification or just, to the field on that issue. There's a very long question here that I'm actually probably not going to go into right this second because I don't have time to read it all, but so I'm going to talk about then the two other student characteristic elements that are part of this webinar today. One is pre-apprenticeship status. The other is work-based learning status. So these are not, you don't necessarily collect this information from the students when they first arrive, but as soon as they enroll in a program that you have identified as a pre-apprenticeship program, or if they're participating in work-based learning activities, then these are the student elements you use to have students show up in certain metrics in the Launch Board. So the work-based learning status is specifically important. It is one of the training milestones that we use to identify that someone has achieved an occupational skills gain. They've completed a paid or unpaid internship is one of the criteria. We're actually working on additional guidance around both workforce preparation and the occupational skills gain that will address the kinds of work-based learning and how you code that moving forward. Go to the next slide. So on the student apprenticeship status, it's a student characteristic element. I have explored with people at the Chancellor's Office of whether we should actually make this a course characteristic as well, so you can identify whether a course section is actually as part of the pre-apprenticeship program or not. But currently, this is the only way of identifying if a student is in a pre-apprenticeship program. We do have access, and we'll be incorporating student data from the Division of Apprenticeship Standards from the state in future builds of the Launch Board, so we will be able to track student transition from pre-apprenticeship into apprenticeship. But what we've essentially done is we've added a code, it's code 2, that they're participating in a pre-apprenticeship program, and that's the new reporting element for that. The student work-based learning status, I believe in the guidance that we are preparing currently, for them to show up in the occupational milestone, you would need to code that as A, which applies to internships and work experience and capstone projects, for that to show up as an occupational skills gain. But these are things you would have to identify and then go in and manually code the student yourself. So just to be aware of that, you need to kind of develop supplemental processes for being sure this data is entered. There were a few colleges involved in the Career Advancement Academies pilots by the state a few years back, and they created a similar student flag, and we had to go in, if a student was in a CAA program, we had to go in and flag them manually as well. So that is actually went much faster than we thought it was. So like I said, we kind of thought of this as a conversation, and so we are very open to kind of taking as much time as people would want to actually take on questions. And provide answers if we can today. If we don't answer any questions today, we will certainly be going through the chat list and providing additional feedback to the field. The DOL, so does the DOL approve pre-apprenticeship programs? They do not approve pre-apprenticeship programs. So currently, there is no requirement that if you have a pre-apprenticeship program that it's approved by DAS or that you are reporting those students to DAS. We believe, I was actually talking to a friend from the California Federation of Labor yesterday, and I think there will be a move to do that, because while we can capture information about students in pre-apprenticeship programs in adult education, there are lots of community-based organizations and other folks, other entities providing pre-apprenticeship training, and we would like to be able to understand the scope of practice in the field across different kinds of institutions. I'm going to access the PowerPoint from last week. So Veronica, we can definitely make that available to you. Copies of this webinar are available anywhere. Yes, there will be. Homeless status. Mark, do you see the question from Bonita Steele there, linking the homeless status as an external supplemental data gathering, the HUD homeless MIS system? Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah, Randy, I see the question. I'm not sure. I would love that kind of input for our work group that's starting next week. So I will take that question to the group. I think one of the things that we're considering around homelessness is if we can devise a question that meets the need of most people and is non-offensive. So for example, have you a place to sleep tonight, and do you know that you'll be in that place for the next 3 months? Seems to be a much nicer way to ask the question, and it might, after we vet it and consider some wordsmithing and so on, be something that other colleges want to use. We might even ask outside of ourselves if other colleges are currently collecting this type of data, what questions they use and what success they've had. So I think our work group has quite a little bit of a project ahead of ourselves, and I would appreciate anyone in the chat room sharing their suggestions, especially around the issue of collecting data on homelessness. I understand you might have a home today, and so you answered the question no, and then 2 weeks into the semester something happens. It's quite common for people at low socioeconomic status to have things happen suddenly, and then they're caught at the moment, and they may be living in their car the next 3 or 4 weeks of the semester. Well, if your college provides services for that type of student, or the student gets an emergency loan from financial aid, I would want your college to be able to check the flag on that student characteristic at the moment the service is provided, and not wait for your VITIA data collection process to circle around every 6 months. But at the same time, we want to report the status on a term basis. So I think there has to be some thinking about how some of these characteristics change over time and how some characteristics are interrelated. For example, homelessness would also suggest economic disadvantage status. And so I would want my college student information system to do some logic checking before I submit my MIS record to see that there's some consistency for the same student. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so related to the question, so Doreen was making a point that it seems like it would be important to kind of standardize the way we're asking the questions, which, as I understand it, Mark, is specifically one of the things you're looking at in that work group, so that people aren't
Right.
Making up their own random versions of questions and maybe kind of capturing different information. Terrence had a question about the implications of this data. So the intent of collecting this data is really, it's for the field. So it's sort of, it's meant for practitioners to be able, particularly in non-credit adult education programs, to look at how they're serving different discrete populations. It is not tied to funding in any way that I'm aware of. Now, one of the things that, in the adult education universe, one of the things that consortia are expected to do, which are composed of at least one college and a group of adult schools, is you're looking at their data together to measure their own effectiveness to help guide how they think about distributing resources in their local process. But I don't have any sense the state's going to look at this and say, oh, you're not serving enough homeless students, so we're actually going to cut your funding. It's really about effectiveness and for practitioners to use to kind of improve the way they serve different students. Kim Shank had a question about the universe of students. And so I'm going to say something, and it's not, because I don't know what the Chancellor's Office totally feels about this, but it's sort of reiterating what I said earlier. We created these new elements specifically to track these characteristics for non-credit students so that we can collect the same information about students in non-credit programs that's being collected in K-12 adult schools who are reporting to Wioa. What that means is we're encouraging everyone to do this for non-credit students. I don't know specifically if the Chancellor's Office feels like that people should be reporting this for credit students. My sense is that that they will not necessarily be requiring you to collect this for your entire universe of students. That would be something, a choice that you would probably make, but I'm saying that and could get, OMED might have a different take on that. I'm not sure, but my focus is on non-credit students specifically for this webinar. Neil's answering questions about data matching between TE and MIS. The Launch Board does collect comprehensive enrollment student level data from K-12 adult schools, and we match that against the MIS records to track really significant issues like, so we could, if someone's identified with a barrier in non-credit or the adult school, we can carry that information through and see how they actually perform on the credit side later on. Someone's identifying the local.
Randy?
Yeah, Mark.
I saw a question from someone about ex-offender status is now being reported on a term-by-term basis. And I think that's mostly to capture the status that changes to, yes, I am an ex-offender, which could happen at any time in a student's academic career. And I do believe it's a permanent characteristic. Once you're an ex-offender, you should remain an ex-offender as far as data collections purposes. But we can seek clarity from the field on that.
About adding fields in the database for storing this data and adding in MIS exports. I do not have an answer to that question, so I'm not sure if anyone in the Chancellor's Office has convened the major ERP providers to actually look up, making sure these are added. I know we introduced these last fall with the idea that it would allow the ERP providers to actually be able to patch and update their systems to collect the additional elements. I actually don't know the progress on that. We've been basically working just to get the Launch Board tab up, and so that is a good question that should probably be explored further. Oh, someone answered it. Madeline and Steve Chan had a question that I will have to go find. Question by Steve Chan. I'm trying to find it. Last week in the previous webinar of AEBG and MIS, unless community college has Wioa 2. Okay, so colleges who are not funded are not receiving Wioa Title II funds through the California Department of Education, we will be collecting your data through MIS and not through TOPS Pro Enterprise. I do believe there are a couple colleges who may continue to do TOPS Pro reporting just because they want to be able to code certain things there. If we have access to that data, we can pull it. We will still capture educational functioning level attainment through TOPS Pro because we know with that data will come through the Wioa Title II reporting that CASAS shares with us, and we are able to match the student records between the two systems to actually identify that it is the same student, as well as for measuring things like transition to post-secondary. Data gathered. So access to the launch board. If you are in an institution, State Center Community College, so if you are in an institution that has an MOU with CalPass Plus, then you can just go on and request a login. All the colleges have access. So you basically go to, so basically you just Google Launchboard or CalPass Launchboard, and if you go to the login page, there's a place there where you can request a login, and they're pretty timely in terms of getting those. There's the data gathered for the currently incarcerated. We actually do get data for the adult jail programs, education programs, and those are captured separately from the regular student population in adult education, and so we're actually going to be disaggregating that. Most of the adult jail programs are basically operated by community colleges or K-12 adult schools, so we will be capturing that. It's based on how that's reported by practitioners. Or ERP stuff. I think. Parents is thankful that his question got answered. Is the launch board data always going to be a year behind? This is a really good question that we are actually in the process of trying to figure out. And I'll just say a couple things about the data that's up there currently. So because we only have 1 year of K-12 adult school data from 16-17, and we don't have access to data for 17-18 yet, but we will be getting that soon. There are certain data elements that are not that don't have anything in them, such as transition to post-secondary, which we have for non-credit programs, but not for students transitioning from K-12 adult schools into community college programs. We will have that in the second build, which will be up in January. The other thing is that Wioa Title II funded institutions do their Wioa Title II reporting on a quarterly basis, and we will start receiving quarterly updates from CASAS this fall. Now, we haven't actually, because we don't, generally updates to the launch board have been on a year-by-year basis, so we are looking at the possibility of doing quarterly refreshes of the data with both the MIS submissions and with the quarterly updates provided to us by CASAS. I don't know what that looks like yet. We're actually redoing the data element dictionary right now, and we'll be looking at that as an issue downstream. To be honest, just the lift of collating and matching all of the data records and building data elements where students could be starting in non-credit or a K-12 adult school and transitioning over to college, or they could be starting in a college and transitioning to the adult school. Getting all of that built was a pretty enormous lift that we are looking at trying to make the data, I guess, more live. It's not really live data, but we are looking at the possibility of quarterly refreshes. Will the Chancellor's Office implement the CCC apply for non-credit in the near future? So the work group that's been meeting at the state level around CCC apply has been having very long, hard discussions about a non-credit application. I missed the last meeting, and so I'm not sure what where the status is. I think there is a desire to get revisions to CCC apply into the field this year. I think there's a timeline of like mid-year to kind of get those moving. So it is definitely on the radar of the people looking at revisions, building a non-credit version of CCC apply, and I think you will see something this year. Even though these are quarterly updates, are researchers able to look back and view data at a monthly level? We don't get data on a month-by-month basis, so that would be something you would need to do locally, would be my take on that. Mark, would you agree?
Yes, and it's quite similar to the MIS data, Mark, where a college can submit as often as they want and refresh or update records. But our refresh cycle is based on how often we get data from the Chancellor's office. And I think our current MOU is that we'll get data from the MIS office once a year, and that we might get updates of the quarterly data sets, but they won't be refreshed until probably when we get the entire data set. Is that what you think will happen?
Well, I think this is still a moving target for us in terms of how often we will be refreshing, because it impacts the data element dictionary in ways that I cannot totally wrap my head around at the moment.
Okay.
So I think there will be some kind of interim updates. It won't be as often as monthly, but there is a desire to see something happen more often than just annually. Should we be submitting AEBG data to MIS quarterly? So we have not taken up the question with the Chancellor's office about whether non-credit data should be reported quarterly on a different cycle than the current MIS updates. And part of the reason for that is I think we're just trying to wrap our heads around the enormity of the data problem and haven't wanted to ask practitioners to do anything different at this point. I will say I've heard it come up occasionally about whether we should be requiring non-credit student data to be reported quarterly, because then we would basically be doing refreshes on the same schedule, potentially on the same schedule as we're doing the CASAS update, so people could look at mid-year data. Will we be able to review data line by line to ensure it is correct? So you should be looking very closely at the coding of your courses and the coding of your students and your processes and practices, and probably doing your own internal review. We don't make student level data accessible to the field. The launch board aggregates, and we don't even display any data element which has a count lower than 10 in order to stay kind of FERPA compliant and to protect the anonymity of students. Will there be reports that we can access? So the launch board is available to all the practitioners. You can go get a log on, and then we are also looking. I should add, we're having discussions about building some export features for the adult education data in the launch board tab, because we think there's going to be specific views practitioners might want to see. Like you might want to see, kind of a consortium level comparison of data for all of your institutions in one page. Also, we've had lots of practitioners with the launch board generally say to us, what I need is something I can print out and take to a meeting, rather than sort of have everyone get on the launch board. So we're talking about that for adult education as well, in terms of having other kinds of reports than just the display of data on your computer. Yeah, there's no discussion about not having I'm trying to interpret your comment there, and I'm not quite sure I'm getting it. I'll look at it more closely and kind of respond to it later. I'm still confused about the timelines for our reporting. Do you stay with the current quarterly schedule? So if you're a K-12 adult school or a Wioa Title II provider, you're still reporting through TOPS Pro Enterprise quarterly. If you're not a Wioa Title II funded provider, you will do your MIS updates, uploads to the state, according to the same schedule you do now. Skills for non-Wioa two schools, it's not likely we can stop using CASA and still report the gains through TE if the college has a system in place. So Madeline, you're asking about reporting a measurable skill. So we will still, if I answer this the right way. There's three ways for pulling measurable skills gained specifically in educational functioning level, one of which is reporting through TOPS Pro Enterprise. And if you are reporting through TOPS Pro Enterprise for Wioa Title II reporting, we will still have access to that data. We also have the other mechanisms for non-Wioa Title II funded entities for using course progression as measured by CB21 course level below college level. And then there's also a new EFL reporting element that we covered last week. So we will look at all three of those places for an educational functioning level, which is a type of measurable skills gain, and then deduplicate those numbers as best we can so we're not counting the student more than once. Looking at Madeline's last comment. Other questions?
I see one question we might have skipped. So someone wants to know, are there any implications that some of these MIS data elements will be missing or incomplete or perhaps invalid for the first semester or two? And would that affect funding in any way, Randy?
It will not affect funding. And just to kind of ratchet expectations, we fully understand at the state level in terms of, like for the launch board and things like that, that this is sort of a new domain for colleges, and it's going to take people a while to get reporting practices in place. I mean, to collect data collection practices in place to really to get this data, and that over time probably collection of the data will get better. Like I said, the purpose of doing this is not related to funding specifically, but really related to understanding what's happening to students in some of these special populations categories for the purposes of practitioners and understanding how to serve them better. So it's really, it's sort of by the field for the field. It's not something the Chancellor's Office said, we need this information and it's going to affect funding. I don't see this showing up in a funding formula at some point, although as wacky as our legislature is, you kind of never know what they're going to fixate on. But, similar to how it's been, primarily the launch board data is practitioner-facing, and at this time is not public-facing. So I don't see it having funding implications unless, it's really going to, issues like, are your students progressing basically in programs more generally? Are we seeing more transition of students into post-secondary education programs? Are we seeing completion of post-secondary credentials at kind of a higher level? Not necessarily for every single population, but those will be significant areas that kind of people would look at to say, are consortia being effective?
Thank you.
Okay, Madeline, I see your question. Yeah, it'd be fine to have a call offline on what you're trying to ask me there.
It looks like we've answered all their questions. I understand the question about SG and whether or not the domain really means all students who receive services or whether it's required for only students who meet the criteria that's currently listed. And I think that's one of the very first things that we'll discuss next week. It looks like our work group has 6 people who are able to meet on Tuesday, so we'll start right away. And I want to have something by the end of this month to share both with our Director of MIS, Todd Hoy, and the field, but we'll need to work pretty quickly to get something done.
I'm going to respond to this question about whether it's possible for non-WIOA funded colleges to eliminate TE for now, because more than one person has indicated they don't think it's possible for colleges to do that. And it may be desirable for a college to continue to report for the TE to capture certain kinds of skills gains. However, colleges have been given specific guidance that they can choose not to report through TE for 2018-19. So it is possible for them to choose not to do that. What they would need to do in terms of measurable skills gains, particularly EFLs, is pay very close attention to their course coding, and they would have to identify systems or identify systems that they're using other kinds of federally approved assessments for reporting with the new EFL data element. So it is possible that if a college chooses to do it, they may lose some MSGs that they may have been capturing through TE, although to be honest, if they're non-WIOA Title II funded, they may not be doing pre and post testing anyway. So they would have the same structural issue about how they identify whether or not that student has made a skills gain. So we do have multiple ways of capturing a skills gain, particularly in ABE, ASE, and ESL, but I don't want to give the impression that there is guidance that colleges still have to use TE if they're not funded through WIOA Title II, because that is actually not what we've been saying to them. It doesn't mean it doesn't need to be explored further or maybe have more discussion, but that is the guidance that in every written document related to that I have seen or produced. We're getting way into the weeds and some back and forth here. There's a question. For WIOA-funded colleges, do we submit only ESL and ABE, ASE through TE and all other programs through MIS? That is actually a good question. So we're going to capture primary enrollment data through MIS is the process, and then we will be matching against TE for capturing the EFL data. That is my understanding of the process as it's going to roll forward after this year. So that's probably something that needs kind of further exploration because we actually haven't gone into the weeds on that case instance. If we continue to do COSIS testing and we are non-WIOA funded, how do we report the pre and post gains? We no longer need to do COSIS testing. If you're not WIOA Title II funded, doing COSIS pre and post testing, or using, if you're not WIOA funded, you could use TABE or another federally approved instrument, is really at the discretion of the college. You can report the pre and post gains through the new EFL data element that we discussed last week, so I would suggest that you go take a look at that. You would need to kind of identify whether the student has achieved an EFL yourself based on their cut scores. And that data element creates a new record every time you enter a new EFL for a student. So we would capture gains through that element or through student progression in courses coded using CB21. See if anything else shows up. It looks like things are slowing down a little bit, so I think we may go ahead and wrap. Mark, is there anything else you would like to share, Mark, before we move on?
I just want to say thank you to Veronica and Melinda for all their technical support and their great introduction. And I want to say thank you to our audience. The questions that you bring forward are good ones, and it helps us all perform better as a state.
All right, Veronica, do you want to wrap us up?
Yes, I will. There is one more question from Neil. He asks, when will we hear from you again? I don't know if you all want to address that or not.
Who again, Neil?
Mark and Randy.
Will you hear? So in terms of coming back with any results, like say from the group, Neil, is that, I'm presuming that's what you're asking? We haven't actually put a timeline on that. I have asked to do. I've talked to Neil about doing a webinar on the Launchboard tab so that people can see can learn more about that. So you're so sweet. Anyway, thank you all very much, and once again, I think you have our email addresses, so you should feel free to contact Mark or I with any additional questions. We will go through the chat box to see what we haven't addressed or answered, to see if there's anything else we want to provide clarification on, and then try and get answers out to the field as quickly as we can. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to talking to you all again soon about something else.
All right, thank you so much, Randy, and thank you again, Mark, for today's webinar. I'm going to close the meeting now, and when I do, the evaluation will appear, so please be sure to fill out this evaluation and let Mark and Randy know what you thought about today's webinar. You can also post any other questions that you may have, and we'll make sure we get that information over to them as well. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.